The theme for today's conference is The Road to Serfdom at 75, the future of classical liberalism and the free market. We are excited to explore these ideas today, both in theory and in practice, and their critiques from the right and the left. We are thankful you are all here, and we are looking forward to a great day. Now, to introduce our opening address. Randal Quarles became a member of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors and took office as Vice Chair for Supervision in October of 2017. He serves as the chair of the Financial Stability Board, an international body that makes recommendations about the global financial system. From 2005 to 2006, he served as Undersecretary of the Treasury for Domestic Finance, and from 2002 to 2005, he was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for International Affairs. He also served as the U.S. Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund. In the administration of George H.W. Bush, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. In between his stints in government service, he worked in private equity at the Carlyle Group and as Managing Director and founder at the Sinosure Group, a Utah-based investment firm. He holds an A.B. in philosophy and economics from Columbia University and a J.D. from here at Yale Law School. Now please join me in welcoming Vice Chair Quarles.
Thank you, Weaver. Thanks very much for that introduction. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm delighted to be back in New Haven, particularly delighted to be in the company of so many people, and especially so many students who are interested in thinking rigorously about ideas. And I'm honored to be participating in the William F. Buckley Program's conference today on Friedrich Hayek and the future of classical liberalism. So over the course of this afternoon, you'll hear a series of presentations that put Hayek's thinking in the context of contemporary developments and offer a variety of perspectives on his intellectual legacy. Hayek was a prolific, some might even say a profligate thinker. He was at various times and in various modes an early neuropsychologist, an epistemologist, a theoretical economist, a political philosopher, a moral philosopher, a philosopher of science, an historian of ideas, a public intellectual, and a social polemicist. This vast range has caused some to undervalue his contributions as an economist, notwithstanding his eventual Nobel Prize. When Hayek moved to the United States in 1950, the University of Chicago Economics Department would not hire him because, as Milton Friedman said, well, at that stage he really wasn't doing any economics. And Paul Krugman famously said, the Hayek thing is almost entirely about politics, not economics. I like that, the Hayek thing part. Others believe his broader thought, while seminal, was inconsistent across these various areas, and Hayek himself never really demonstrated how it all hung together. So in my contribution to the discussion today, I want to examine a particular example of the lasting effect that Hayek has had on economic thinking, one pertaining to the importance of freely determined prices for producing efficient economic outcomes, and then consider briefly how Hayek's insights in this area can in fact tie together the various strands of his larger philosophy. And then, unfortunately, fortunately, a governor of the Federal Reserve does have to sing for his supper, and so as not to appear entirely out of touch with more immediate developments, I'll end by descending from the Empyrean to the terrestrial with a discussion of the economic outlook and the Federal Open Market Committee's policy discussion from earlier this week. Hayek's contributions to economics ranged widely, and many were important and of lasting influence. Among them were his studies of the relationship between the economic and political arrangements of a society. That body of work included, of course, his celebrated book, The Road to Serfdom, which was published 75 years ago this year and is a focus of this event, as well as his later and more detailed monograph, The Constitution of Liberty. In addition, Hayek contributed prominently to monetary analysis, His work in this area included the theory of the business cycle that was part of the thinking of the Austrian School of Economics. It also included his studies of the feasibility and implications of private sector currency issuance, contributions that have informed modern-day analyses of the repercussions of electronic money and actually seem very up-to-date in the very active discussions in the international arena around the potential implications of stablecoins. Today, however, I'll be concerned instead with still another key contribution that Hayek made to economic analysis: understanding the operation of the price system. This contribution was formalized in his most famous paper in the economic research literature, his article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, which was published in the American Economic Review in September of 1945. It's worth outlining the basis for the high esteem in which many economists still hold Hayek's 1945 contribution. In 1974, the press release by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences that announced Hayek's Nobel Prize in Economics stated, "The Academy is of the opinion that von Hayek's analysis of the functional efficiency of different economic systems is one of his most significant contributions to economic research in the broader sense. His guiding principle, when comparing various systems, is to study how efficiently all the knowledge and all the information dispersed among individuals and enterprises are utilized. His conclusion is that only by far-reaching decentralization in a market system with competition and free price fixing is it possible to make full use of knowledge and information." In the research that the Academy described, this 1945 article of Hayek's was the key paper. More recently, this paper received further prominent acclaim when it was categorized by an expert panel as being one of the top 20 articles ever published in the American Economic Review. With regard to the paper's contribution to the understanding of economic processes, an illuminating discussion was provided in 2005 by Oliver Williamson, himself later a Nobel laureate in economics. Williamson cited Hayek's 1945 paper, along with Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations from the 18th century, as forming the core of a venerated tradition in economics of studying the notion of spontaneous order arising from a freely operating market system. So how does Hayek's case for the price system fit in alongside the other work that Williamson mentioned? As Paul Samuelson, yet another Nobel Prize winner, had occasion to note, the argument for the price system that Hayek articulated in 1945 was complementary with, but distinct from, the argument that Adam Smith espoused in The Wealth of Nations. Smith focused on how market mechanisms guide producers toward satisfying consumers' wants. Hayek instead stressed how the market mechanism makes, as he put it, fuller use of the existing knowledge than a directed economy is able to do. Hayek emphasized that the signals transmitted by the various individual prices in the economy could, together, serve as a useful means for guiding overall resource allocation. And the reason is that prices convey messages to consumers and producers, even when the information that drives prices is not directly aggregated or even directly observed. For example, a large increase or decrease in the price of gasoline conveys information that influences consumer behavior, that also affects the behavior of energy producers, even when neither of these sets of market participants are aware of the precise factor initiating the price change. As a related matter, Hayek recognized that prices transmit information even in a situation in which much of that information is not explicitly disclosed by one market participant to another, or even consciously articulable by any market participant at all. Hayek believed that all of us know many things that we cannot articulate, but that we nevertheless act upon in practical situations. And the price system can therefore aggregate and transmit that knowledge which we could not otherwise convey. Now, this analysis had implications for the viability of different economic systems. With regard to centrally planned economic systems, which had considerable support in the West in 1945, in light of the increased use of government economic controls in many countries during World War II and the dismal performance of market economies during the Great Depression, Hayek's analysis suggested that these systems would likely exhibit great inefficiency. To Hayek, it was totally unrealistic to expect an economy to operate efficiently if it was based on the direction of the whole economic system according to one unified plan, because such a plan would lack the valuable information that's embedded in market-determined prices. The economist Greg Mankiw has elegantly summed up Hayek's insight here. Information is very, very dispersed among the population. Nobody can possibly know all the information you need to run a centrally planned economy. Hayek's economic analysis therefore complemented the philosophical and political arguments that he marshaled against centrally planned economies in The Road to Serfdom. But it's important to recognize that this problem of aggregating knowledge is not a contingent or a technological problem. It's not only that the vast dispersion of knowledge makes it hard to gather, although that's certainly true, but if that were the only issue, then perhaps future advances in technology, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, would remove that obstacle. Rather, we all know many important things that we cannot articulate. And many of these things we come to know precisely through our participation in trade and exchange through the market. So this type of knowledge is A, by its nature, not conveyable to a central planner because we're not fully aware of all we know, and B, would not even exist apart from the social interactions facilitated by the market, which a central planner would replace. The flip side of Hayek's analysis was that while there are insurmountable obstacles to economic efficiency via a central plan, an efficient economy may still be obtainable by letting the price system work. To quote Mankiw again, Hayek's analysis implies that markets figure out a way to aggregate in a decentralized way dispersed information into desirable outcomes. Furthermore, this mechanism doesn't require the government or any one individual to process that dispersed information into a central network or to be able to aggregate the information into a statistical series. It's instead sufficient for the proper operation of the price mechanism that the relevant information be embodied implicitly in the economy's multiplicity of prices of individual goods and factors of production. This information is recorded in such prices because they respond to the behavior of individual buyers and sellers in the economy. Consequently, as longtime Hayek scholar Gerald O'Driscoll, who will be with us later in the afternoon, has observed, what particularly recommends the price system to Hayek is the economy of knowledge with which it operates. It is, in Hayek's description, nothing short of a marvel. So this 1945 paper has had a great influence on subsequent economic research. It's been found to be highly relevant to a variety of areas of economic inquiry. For example, Hayek's analysis has proved valuable in the development of standard microeconomics, since his contribution deepened economists' understanding of the working of the price system and promoted further investigation of the question of how decentralized information is transmitted by markets. Hayek's emphasis on prices as processors of information has also had application in international trade theory. And in macroeconomics and monetary theory, Milton Friedman's Nobel lecture, published in 1977, cited Hayek's 1945 paper when arguing that because it disrupted the signals arising from relative price movements, inflation both lowered the efficiency of the economy and led output to deviate from its natural or full employment level. Hayek likened the price system to a system of telecommunications, and Friedman's description of inflation as a form of static, interrupting price signals was in keeping with this analogy. Hayek's ideas on prices influenced Joseph Stiglitz in his analysis of markets with asymmetric information, and Roger Myerson's insights on mechanism design theory. Each of those bodies of work also earned a Nobel Prize. I don't want to leave the impression, though, that all of the conclusions in Hayek's 1945 paper have become unchallenged principles chiseled into the economic consensus. On the contrary, one of the reasons why the paper has been so influential is that it remains a benchmark reference for understanding the case for relying primarily on a market system based on freely determined prices, for determining the production and allocation of resources, and by setting a high bar for preempting the price system or for other interventions in the market. When economists point to cases in which market mechanisms can be improved on, they believe, by regulation or other public sector intervention, or to instances in which price signals don't appear to be operating effectively, they need to identify a specific market failure as the source of the inefficiency. Essentially, they need to establish instances in which the price system can be improved upon as a means of processing information, or the general ecosystem in which prices are operating can be clarified in order to improve the value of the signal. Even Hayek acknowledged that the price mechanism works within an ecosystem of laws and social institutions, and those may evolve in ways that interfere with the signaling of prices. For example, one of the important events that raised doubts about the functioning of the private markets pricing process occurred in the years leading up to the financial crisis. This period featured pricing by financial markets that seemed, in some prominent cases, not to be adequately reflecting information about actual risks. Spreads on risky private sector debt reached very low levels, and damaging spillovers to the non-financial sector occurred in the form of unduly high real estate prices and excessive leverage by borrowers in the housing market. One of my predecessors at the Federal Reserve Board, Donald Cohn, has noted the seeming herd-like behavior of financial markets in the pre-crisis period that generated this situation, an underpricing of risk. The financial crisis and the deep recession that followed it prompted changes in the United States regulatory framework, the ecosystem, if you will, in which the price system needs to operate. These changes have been designed to make the financial system more resilient than it was before the crisis. By creating appropriate incentives and rules, they should also encourage financial markets to price risk more appropriately, to factor in more information than they did in the years leading up to the crisis. For example, by reducing the danger of investor complacency regarding the riskiness of their investments and the possibility of adverse scenarios. If we follow Hayek and regard the price system like a telecommunications network, and then apply that metaphor to the financial sector, we can think of the institutional and regulatory changes to the financial system over the past decade as designed to improve the reliability and signal quality of the transmissions. How does all of this relate to the larger questions of philosophy and social order, to which Hayek devoted much of his thought? Hayek's insights about the price system depend importantly on his theory of knowledge. The information that's available to us as a society is the aggregate of the highly dispersed and sometimes inarticulate knowledge possessed by each of us individually. It's not only hard to convey that information to a central authority for processing into a rational decision, it's in many cases conceptually impossible given the nature of that knowledge. And indeed, important parts of that knowledge will not even be generated except through our interaction with each other through the mechanism of the market. Trying to centralize economic decision-making, then, is not just too hard to do as a practical matter. It would actually reduce the amount of knowledge available to us as a society by replacing those myriad individual interactions in a free marketplace. Thus, even if some technological way to aggregate information other than through prices could be invented, and with advances in technology, they may be invented soon, those ways would lead to less efficient, less humane outcomes, because this aggregation would be based on less total human information. The price mechanism, then, is not just a matter of economics, despite the importance that it has had in that discipline. It's a matter of social and indeed civilizational progress. As Hayek says in the Constitution of Liberty, civilization begins when the individual, in pursuit of his ends, can make use of more knowledge than he himself has acquired, and when he can transcend the boundaries of his ignorance by profiting from knowledge that he himself does not possess. I think this ties together the various threads of Hayek's thought throughout a long life. His early work on psychology, how do we know? His later epistemology, what do we know, and what does it mean to know it? His economics, how do we make knowledge usable? And his social and political theory, what institutions will ensure that the greatest amount of human knowledge will be usable in the pursuit of human fulfillment? Contrary to those polemicists across the ideological spectrum, whose tendentious simplification of Hayek's thought would turn him into a crude icon rather than a complex thinker, I think this is a deeply human and deeply humane project. So I look forward today to the contributions of the others you'll hear from on how Hayek elaborated it and how we can further those principles today. Now, as is required, I believe, by federal law, I would like to turn to the current economic scene and this week's FOMC decision. Let me start by saying that the U.S. economy is doing well. Certainly the employment figures that were released this morning would strongly support that. I'm optimistic about the outlook. Economic conditions are currently very close to meeting that is the Federal Open Market Committee's dual mandate objectives of maximum sustainable employment and price stability. A particular source of strength has been the labor market. Setting aside the monthly volatility and even the effects of the recent strike at General Motors, labor market indicators are as strong as they have been in quite some time. I would say that I was surprised, I think most observers are surprised, that notwithstanding the General Motors strike, the employment figures were as strong as they were. The employment rate has been running near a 50-year low. The proportion of the population currently employed is close to its highest level in a decade. Encouragingly, labor force participation has held up, as the tight labor market has motivated workers to either join or remain in the labor force, halting, at least for the time being, what had been a long-standing downward trend. The pace of job gains in the aggregate had seemed to decelerate somewhat this year, but we shouldn't find that surprising. We should expect some deceleration because of how low the employment rate has fallen. At a certain point, that will just be mathematics. A strong job market, high employment have in turn supported economic growth. Personal consumption expenditures grew by 2.5% over the past 4 quarters. That's a healthy pace by historical standards. That's a major contributor to overall growth, since consumption represents about 2/3 of economic activity. Because the labor market remains tight, I expect wage growth to pick up, which would then, in turn, underpin further strength in consumption and overall growth. For the other half of our mandate, inflation, as measured by the PCE index, was 1.3% over the 12 months ending in September, while core PCE inflation, which excludes increases in the prices of food and energy, was 1.7%. While those readings are below our 2% inflation objective, they're fairly close, and my assessment is that inflation will inch toward our objective in the coming months. Outside the near term, I'm also optimistic about the longer-term potential of the U.S. economy. I'm heartened by a recent pickup in labor productivity growth. A notable development of the post-crisis period has been the abysmal pace of labor productivity growth. After averaging at about 2.25% in the 2 decades leading up to the crisis, labor productivity growth has been closer to 1% on average since 2011. And while there's been much speculation, it remains to be seen what was driving that slowdown, and consequently that slowdown could resolve unpredictably. If we don't really know what was causing it, we can't really be sure when it might turn around. And although the quarterly data are volatile, I've been encouraged by a pickup in labor productivity in the first half of this year when it grew at a 3% annual rate. And further out, I will admit to being a bit of a techno enthusiast. I see the potential for many emerging technologies, 5G communications, artificial intelligence and machine learning, 3D printing, to name only a few, to further boost productivity growth in the coming years. Having established my optimism, I will circle back to some worrying signs in the recent data that suggest some headwinds are holding back growth. One prominent factor weighing on a relatively robust domestic economy has been weak growth among our trading partners. The International Monetary Fund projects that global economic growth in 2019 will be the slowest since the financial crisis, and partly as a consequence of weak foreign growth, U.S. exports have been flat over the past year. And another weak spot has been business investment. After a strong 2017 and a strong start to 2018, business fixed investment has tailed off this year and fallen outright in the second and third quarters. I think the weakness of investment is a particular concern because increasing investment in the capital stock are important for raising the potential capacity of the economy. It's likely that some of the weakness in capital spending is a result of elevated uncertainty for foreign growth generally, but also specifically for trade developments. Against this backdrop, at our meeting earlier this week, we at the Federal Open Market Committee decided to lower our target range for the Fed funds rate for the third time this year. We took this action to help keep the U.S. economy strong in the face of global developments and to provide some insurance against these ongoing risks that I described. By lowering the Fed funds rate this year, we're supporting the continued expansion of the economy, and overall, with these policy adjustments, I believe that the economy will remain in a good place, with the labor market remaining strong and inflation staying close to that 2% objective. We see the stance of monetary policy as likely to remain appropriate as long as incoming information about the economy continues to be broadly consistent with our outlook of moderate economic growth, a strong labor market, and inflation near our symmetric 2% objective. So thank you again for having me here, and I'd be delighted to answer some questions about any of the topics here or anything else that might be on your mind, and looking forward to it. Thank you again.
If you just want to...
Would you care to provide your comments regarding negative interest rates and modern monetary policy?
So negative interest rates have not been on the table in the United States. So in a public forum, I will avoid criticizing the policy of other central banks around the world. I do think that, but I do think that those who consider the effects of negative interest rates would need to consider that they may have different effects depending on the length of time that market participants expect them to be in place. Clearly, negative interest rates will have an effect on the financial sector. They reduce the net interest income of banks through inverting the yield curve and pushing short-term interest rates below zero. In some cases, even longer-term interest rates below zero. That is the argument, and affecting the financial sector affects the transmission mechanism through which a monetary policy and economic policy in general will operate. The argument for those who have favored negative interest rates is that, well, yes, but negative interest rates, by supporting general economic activity, increase the value of the existing portfolio on a bank's books. As a consequence, this will be a net positive for the financial sector. They'll make less money on net interest income, but they'll lose less money on their portfolio. And so we are supporting the financial sector that way. And then we're obviously supporting the rest of the economy through extremely low interest rates, and all of that's positive. I don't know whether that actually operates in fact, but there's a theoretical justification for it, so I can see that. I think that's harder to maintain if you say, however, that negative interest rates, even very low interest rates, are going to obtain for a very long period of time, because at some point that portfolio that was originated, that was underwritten in one environment and therefore can benefit by lower losses, by changing the interest rate environment in which that portfolio then matures, will now be underwritten in the new environment. And unless the underwriters are completely incompetent at their jobs, you would not there are people who believe that, but I don't think that's likely. Then you would not expect the interest rate environment to provide that extra juice to the portfolio, and all you have left is the effect on the current earnings capacity of the financial sector, which is a net negative. I don't think anyone argues that that's not a net negative in an environment of negative interest rates. So I do think that raises difficult questions as well if consumers in an economy perceive that negative interest rates, even extremely low interest rates, are going to persist for a very long period of time as opposed to an emergency reaction, then at some point they'll say, well, if this is going to maintain for perhaps the rest of my life, I'm not going to earn as much on my savings as I might have expected to, and so I'm going to need to save more, which means I will consume in the immediate environment less. That would be a net drag on the economy. So I'm not arguing that these are firm conclusions, but I think these are questions that have to be asked for those who would maintain negative interest rates over a long period of time, as to might they have different effects when perceived by various market participants as a permanent feature of the landscape than they might as emergency responses.
Thanks. I enjoyed your comments about the role of prices, and I was wondering if, as a purely philosophical matter, you detect any tension between your critique of central planning and your role as a central banker, as essentially a central planner in a centrally planned market for money and credit.
I was expecting that question.
You're welcome.
As everyone in this room knows, Hayek was not a fan of the central banking as currently practiced, and indeed believed that a private system of money would be in many ways superior to a both governmentally issued and governmentally modulated system of money. I think, however, that if you look at the alternatives, you have to consider, what's the possible world in which we might live in. So in the United States, we had a private system of money, as most people in this room would know, for a long period of time in the 19th century, where money essentially was notes that were issued by private banks, each of them backed only by that private bank and circulating around the country. That was an extremely inefficient system because the notes didn't have to circulate very far away from the issuing bank before people were uncertain what they might be worth, even though they all purported to be worth $1, say. And so that was, there was a reason for the creation of a national system of currency because of the inefficiency of, say, a purely private system of money. So suppose you have not a purely private system of money, but the one that is constrained by the gold standard, again, which would certainly change the character of central banking as it's currently practiced. There were a lot of inefficiencies with the gold standard as well that generated significant volatility in liquidity, contributed to financial crises that ultimately reduced the efficiency of economic activity. So if you look at in the realm of practical possibilities for alternatives to our current system. I don't think that some of the principal alternatives hold up very well. I do think, though, that I didn't talk much about it, but one of Hayek's key insights, key principles with respect to governmental action is that it should be as rules-based and as predictable as possible. And I think that that is an important principle for central banks to keep in mind, notwithstanding that we have to live in the world that we live in. Central banks should follow a strategy that is as clear as is possible to the public, to market participants, as part of creating that ecosystem in which private decisions, displayed through private transactions in the market, can transmit the signals that they are supposed to and aggregate the information that they're supposed to. I think a central bank can be part of that ecosystem. Indeed, I think probably is a useful part of that ecosystem if it is as strategic and predictable as possible.
Vice Chair Quarles, over here, sorry. As somebody who's done both, what advice would you give to Yale students who maybe don't know between the public sector or private sector work? What advice would you give to them?
Well, so my advice would be do both. When I was your age and was thinking about the options in front of me, I considered the private sector, I considered academia, and I considered public policy. I've never done academia, but I've interacted with a lot of academics. Some of my best friends are academics. And I have done both the private and the public sector. And I would say the differences among them, as I see it, are these. So in the private sector, particularly, I was a lawyer in the private sector. This is particularly true for lawyers, but I think it's true in general for the private sector. You accept the world as a given, and your job is to achieve certain objectives within those givens. Your ability to change the givens is relatively limited. So you find the way to achieve your objectives that way. As an academic, you can think about the world as it ought to be, but your ability to effect that change is relatively limited. But you're completely free to think about how things ought to be. The appeal of public policy, and I think one of the reasons why no one I know who has ever served in a senior position, senior public policy position, has ever said, I never want to do that again, has ever been unwilling to return, is that you actually have the ability to bring together all of those skill sets and exercise them all. You actually, part of your job is to think about, so how ought the world to be different? And then you have a material ability in the range of your responsibilities to push it in that direction. And that is, again, professionally, personally, very satisfying. If you have a desire to give back, that's one of the best ways to give back. But it all depends on being able to bring to that task skill sets that you have generally developed elsewhere, in my view, that you have through study, through commitment to thinking about ideas. You've thought about the world as it ought to be, as all the students in here. That's why you're here. Generally in the private sector, although there are other ways that you could, I suppose, that you could get these skills. You develop sort of skills, professional skills of application to see, so how does the world work? That sharpens your view of how it might be better, and also how things are done, how to get things done, how people interact with each other. And you can bring all of that together into a public policy position. It's a very satisfying thing to do, and I would recommend to everyone here that you think about that as part of your career. That may sound a little bit like we had I won't embarrass him with his name, although many of you will recognize who it is by the just by the anecdote. But when I was a lawyer, we had come speak to our partners meeting once, a relatively celebrated Nobel Prize winner whose work had been in the area of finance, whose rather arch comment at the beginning when someone asked him some question about the Nobel Prize said, "I recommend that if you receive one, you accept it."
Thank you. So I guess, are you worried about increasing business leverage and deteriorating borrowing standards and lending standards? Because CLO levels are rising and the Fed is cutting rates, which is fueling excesses and financial vulnerabilities. And so in addition to that, what tools does the Fed have to respond to this? And could the CCYB be one of those options? Thank you.
Whoa, that's a pretty good question. So I do think that that's something that we look at, the effect of the current interest rate environment on potential financial stability risks. We examine that at the Fed. We make an assessment quarterly of how we see financial stability risks, and it's true that there are certain categories of assets. Commercial real estate is one in particular. Certain types of business debt, the volume of business debt has been growing. The amount of leverage that companies are taking on, in particular, is higher than it has been in the past. And the underwriting standards of those loans have, in many cases, eroded, sort of as a general matter. And so, I mean, just as concrete examples, some of you might easily be thinking, what does that mean to say underwriting standards have eroded? But in some cases, banks look at the earnings before income taxes and depreciation of a company, determine what they have been historically, but then in order to be able to underwrite a larger amount of debt, make certain adjustments to that. They say, well, yeah, but this year EBITDA was lower than it ought to have been, and here we measured EBITDA on a Tuesday, and maybe we should have measured it on a Wednesday. And so you conclude that if you made a number of assumptions, EBITDA would be higher, which would allow you to make a larger loan. There are a number of practices like that, which are not always illegitimate. I did M&A for a long time, and there are a number of good reasons why you would sort of adjust EBITDA for factors that you think are non-recurring and don't really reflect the long-term earnings capacity of a company. But it's awfully easy to go down a slippery slope and just begin arguing yourself or reverse engineering yourself into the deal you want to do, as opposed to the deal that your framework, your underwriting framework would allow you to do. So that is all in general happening. I don't view this as a financial stability problem, however. I think it's important as we think about some of these risks to draw a line between future events that may amplify a business downturn, that may cause people to lose money upon a repricing of assets at some point in the future, and those that may translate themselves as a consequence into actual financial instability. And the reason that I don't think we have a financial instability problem is that when we go through and make these assessments quarterly, the last thing we look at is what's the overall level of leverage in the financial sector. If some of these assets that we're concerned about do reprice themselves precipitously and the holders lose a lot of money, does that create a risk of a destabilizing run in the financial sector because people aren't sure whether their counterparties will be solvent any longer, their financial sector counterparties? We have such a low level of leverage in the financial sector. We have so greatly increased the amount of capital and the amount of liquidity in the financial sector that basically that, if you will, swamps the other factors that we're looking at, and that causes us to conclude that basically financial system vulnerabilities, the potential of a systemic crisis as opposed to a business downturn, is relatively moderate. We've said that now that for those who are not bank regulatory mavens around here, which I expected would be everyone, but we have a question on the CCYB here. The countercyclical capital buffer is an element of our current regulatory system that allows, the central banks around the world have agreed that when we see financial system vulnerabilities rising, and the Fed has said that when we see them to be meaningfully above normal, we would actually increase the amount of capital that the banking system is required to hold as a way of reining in the development of that excessive leverage. And then come the future downturn, we would be able to turn down that countercyclical capital buffer again back to a lower level to allow the banking system to continue to lend even into a business downturn to help moderate the effect of that downturn. Hence, it's countercyclical. We have never turned on the countercyclical capital buffer in the United States. A number of other countries have done so. But when you look at their overall capital framework, we actually still have, notwithstanding not having turned on our countercyclical capital buffer, a higher level of capital, a better capitalized industry than really any other, certainly any other advanced financial economy, any other serious financial sector in the world, systemically consequential financial sector in the world. So and that's because when we calibrated our through-the-cycle capital requirements, we generally calibrated them at the highest level that international agreement would have contemplated, and in some cases even higher. So I won't go deeply into the weeds. As you can tell, I'm tempted. It's so easy for me to be sucked into the weeds on these topics. But basically, our through-the-cycle capital requirements are so high that we don't need to turn on the countercyclical capital buffer in order to reach that point when we look at financial system vulnerabilities to say we brought them down from above normal to normal. I characterize that as essentially our countercyclical capital buffer is already on because notwithstanding countries like the UK, Hong Kong, there are a variety of countries around the world that have turned on their countercyclical capital buffer, we still have that extra buffer in our system against the potential repricing of assets that we see as potentially overvalued and subject to precipitate change. That buffer still exists. That creates, in my view, a problem for us. Because one of the things that the countercyclical capital buffer allows you to do is that come the business downturn, you can turn it down. You turned it up to sort of to push back against the boom, and you can turn it down in order to provide some cushion against the bust. We can't turn ours down because we basically turned all the dials up and then we broke the dials off the dashboard in our system. So I have proposed, the board has not decided to do this yet, but I think it will come under consideration by the board. So I have proposed in some speeches that we should, in fact, take a portion of our existing through-the-cycle capital regime and turn that into countercyclical capital buffer. Recognize, if you will, that our countercyclical capital buffer is effectively already on. And what that would allow us to do is that come some future downturn, we would be able to turn it down, which we don't really now have a mechanism to do, to support continued lending and by the financial sector to the real economy at the time of a downturn when we might really want it. The British, not particularly viewed as particularly bloody-minded people, have in fact done something very like that. They have the most experience of anyone in the world with this countercyclical capital buffer. They've turned it on, they've turned it off, they've turned it on. Brexit and their incomprehensible political system has caused the central bank to gain a lot of experience with this particular tool. And what they have learned from it is that it's actually not so useful turning it on as a buffer against financial excesses going forward, but it's very useful to be able to turn it down to support financial sector activity during a downturn. And so they have actually moved to a system where more and more of their so-called permanent capital has been translated into this flexible capital buffer or countercyclical capital buffer at the top of the stack. So I will stop because I could go on forever, but I hope that was responsive.
That's all the time we have. We'll reconvene
Oh, geez.
at 2 p.m. sharp.